Welcome to Parenti Stuff, the podcast. I am your host, Lumpy Louise, and this is the read and discuss of Democracy for the Few, 9th edition. Chapter 11, the U.S. Global Military Empire. So, we are on Chapter 11. We only got 9 more chapters to go, so 8 more weeks after this. And, yeah. So I'm just going to get started on this. I'm not sure if Rick's coming up or not, but if he does, there's probably plenty for him to talk on this one. So we are up to Chapter 11, which is called the U.S. Global Military Empire. And so in the time that this edition was coming out, 2010 is the 9th edition, the U.S. would have been considered the sole superpower. But since then, I would say that China has now emerged, though many experts still call them, in India and Russia, emerging superpowers. And they do this because though China is definitely an economic superpower, they are not considered a militaristic one. And yes, there's lots to ponder over that whole thought. So, especially when we dig into this chapter, you'll kind of figure that one out. So, all right. So, even though the Cold War ended decades ago, the military budget has continued to rise with significant allocations going towards hundreds of bases, about 750 in 80 countries right now. The U.S. also funds foreign military programs like Ukraine and Israel, allowing other nations to purchase weapons from American firms that are subsidized with taxpayer money. This chapter discusses the consequences of U.S. military interventions, such as the devastation in Iraq following the Gulf War, not to mention I'll bring up us pulling out of Iraq, where U.S. actions led to significant civilian casualties and long-term environmental damage. Also, the bombing of Yugoslavia under the pretext of humanitarian intervention, they love using that lie, resulted in widespread destruction and suffering, contradicting the narrative of protecting human rights. If you want to read, I was gonna read something of Parenti's this time, but like a little article. But the one I picked out, then I realized, I didn't want to talk too much on Ukraine, so it was the 2014 Ukraine. So I'll bring that one up. But also, Parenti was like the Yugoslavia stuff was. Parenti talked a lot about. He doesn't. He doesn't do a lot of like Black Shirts and Reds is of course about fascism, and then he has To Kill a Nation is about Yugoslavia. So there's all that there. So hello, Holy Water. How you doing? Anywho, so the U.S. foreign policy has often supported oppressive regimes while undermining democratic movements, especially in Latin American countries where the U.S. backed military coups against reformist governments. These moves do not spread democracy, as our leaders claim. And in this age of neocolonialism, they have engaged in actions that promote economic imperialism and the interests of corporate America. The military-industrial complex is characterized by rampant waste and fraud, with significant portions of the budget unaccounted for, leading to billions lost to inefficiencies and corruption. The Pentagon procurement processes are plagued by cost overruns and lack of oversight, allowing contractors to profit at the expense of taxpayers. Moreover, hello, Ash. Now I have to appeal. Lovely. So, I don't know. I just got a warning, so we'll see if I get struck down or not. I don't know. Hold on. It's probably... Ash, did you get rid of that? They're probably reporting me. because I said the word Yugoslavia. Submit. All right, so, oh, this thing is so slow. All right, so I just submitted that. Oh, that's okay, Holy Water. Don't worry about it. I just submitted and I got the appeal, so it's all right. Moreover, military spending is shown to create fewer jobs compared to investments in healthcare or education, raising concerns about the prioritization of the military expenditures over social welfare. The chapter concludes that U.S. military interventions and economic policies have often exacerbated poverty and dependency in developing nations, undermining their sovereignty and economic stability. I'm going to bring this in now. It kind of, it fits in with this chapter, but I wanted to bring up because the edition 9 came out in 2010, so he would not have really been writing on like the whole droning thing that Obama was doing at that time, so he wouldn't have known that. There is a bunch of files in the Intercept called the Drone Papers, and they call it the Squirrel Archive. So if you ever want to read about all the droning stuff, these were from whistleblowers sending it out. So this was back in 2015. I'm just going to read a couple of paragraphs from this Intercept article by Jeremy Scahill. The assassination complex. The whistleblower who leaked the drone papers believes the public is entitled to know how people are placed on kill lists and assassinated on orders from the president. Drones are a tool, not a policy. The policy is assassination. While every president since Gerald Ford has upheld an executive order banning assassinations by, all right, probably doesn't like that word. All right. This is going to be so difficult because I'm not going to be able to say that word. So we're just going to call it unaliving, I guess, but you know it means something bigger than that. So the unaliving by U.S. personnel, Congress has avoided legislating the issue or even defining the word unaliving. This has allowed proponents of the drone wars to rebrand unaliving with more palatable characterizations, such as the term du jour, targeted unalivings. When the Obama administration has discussed drone strikes publicly, it has offered assurances that such operations are a more precise alternative to boots on the ground and are authorized only when an imminent threat is present and there is near certainty that the intended target will be eliminated. Those terms, however, appear to have been bluntly redefined to bear almost no resemblance to their commonly understood meanings. The first drone strike outside of the declared war zone was conducted more than 12 years ago. This is 2015, so it was he's talking about 2003. Yet it was not until May 2013 that the White House released a set of standards and procedures for conducting such strikes. Those guidelines offered little specificity, asserting that the U.S. would only conduct a lethal strike outside of an area of active hostilities if the target represented a continuing imminent threat to U.S. persons, without providing any sense of the internal process used to determine whether a suspect should be unalived without being indicted or tried. The implicit message on the drone strikes from the Obama administration has been one of trust, but do not verify. All right, so if you want to read more of that, like I said, this one was the unaliving complex, and and it's the Intercept, and it's a big file of them called the Squirrel Archive on the Intercept. So You can look those up and look into that more often. All right, let me start playing chapter. Let me get to the chapter first. Was that? Nope. That was too far. Sorry. And then I think I have to make this a little bigger. I don't know, it was a little off today. I don't know why it wouldn't do the front page. Okay, that'll work. All right, I'm going to press start.
The U.S. Global Military Empire. The United States is said to be a democracy, but it is also the world's only superpower, with a global military empire of a magnitude never before seen in history. What purpose does this empire serve? A global kill capacity. The U.S. military has a nuclear overkill capacity of more than 8,000 long-range missiles and 22,000 tactical ones, along with ground and air forces ready to strike anywhere, and a fleet larger in total tonnage and firepower than all the other navies of the world combined, with only 5%. Of the Earth's population, the United States devotes more to military expenditures than all the other industrialized nations put together. Over the last half-century, U.S. leaders deployed thousands of nuclear weapons and hundreds of thousands of military personnel to over 350 major bases and hundreds of minor installations spanning the globe. This massive deployment supposedly was needed to contain a Soviet Union bent on world domination, although evidence indicates that the Soviets were never the threat they were made out to be by our Cold War policymakers. Despite the overthrow of the USSR and other Eastern European communist nations in 1990 to 1992, U.S. military allocations continued at budget-busting stratospheric levels, and U.S. overseas military strength remained deployed in much the same pattern as before, with its Cold War arsenal of long-range nuclear missiles aimed mostly at the former Soviet Union, an enemy that no longer exists. In recent years, the list of sites targeted by U.S. nuclear weapons actually grew by 20%, including new targets in Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, China, Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. The direct yearly military appropriations rose to about $534 billion by 2010, really closer to $850 billion if we count the indirect costs of war and empire, such as veterans' benefits and medical costs, annual debt payments due to military spending, covert military and intelligence operations, the 70% of federal research and development funds that goes to the military, supplementary appropriations for specific wars as in Iraq and Afghanistan, and defense expenses picked up by non-military agencies including defense-related activities of the General Services Administration, along with the Energy Department's nuclear weapons programs, which consumes more than half of that department's budget. The U.S. government also runs a foreign military financing program, which gives billions of dollars a year to other countries to purchase weaponry from U.S. firms. The U.S. taxpayers fully subsidize these sales, while the profits go to the corporate arms dealers. The federal budget is composed of discretionary spending and mandatory spending. In the discretionary budget, more money is spent on the military than on all domestic programs combined. The Bush administration made an accelerated effort to develop the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars. First proposed in the mid-1980s, Star Wars is an outer space missile program that supposedly would intercept and destroy all incoming warheads launched by other nations. Over the years, the Pentagon has spent more than $120 billion unsuccessfully trying to create this space shield, and wants another $62 billion for the years 2010 to 2014. If the Star Wars project ever does prove successful, it will make the nuclear arsenals of other nations obsolete and deprive them of any deterrence against U.S. nuclear missiles. This in turn will encourage them to spend more to update their own long-range attack systems. Also, Star Wars is in violation of the Outer Space Treaty, signed by 91 nations, including the United States, which bans weapons of mass destruction in space. A chief of the U.S. Space Command enthused, "We're going to fight from space and we're going to fight into space. We will engage terrestrial targets someday, ships, airplanes, land targets from space." The professed goal of the U.S. Space Command is to dominate the space dimension of military operations to protect U.S. interests and investments. The military already can beam powerful electromagnetic or pulsed radio frequency radiation transmissions back to Earth, seriously impairing the mental capacity of whole populations, causing severe physiological disruption or perceptual disorientation for an extended period, according to the Air Force.
Okay, if anyone wants to come up, Rick, if you want to come up, Cutie, anyone wants to come up and discuss anything, you're welcome to come up. My cat is running around my computer, and I'm afraid they're going to You need to get down. Sorry. I'm all over the
That
place.
last
today.
little bit
Yeah.
it is some Jesse Ventura's conspiracy stuff about HARP. That makes me sad.
Yeah.
HARP is like a normal it was like a normal thing. But everyone was very freaked out about it.
There is a few things that, I don't agree with Parenti on, and and there's a few. It's also like, this is why it's like so hard to do this like with the updated stuff, because like there is that chance of getting something wrong. You know what I mean? Like looking at something. But I was saying, like, he brings up the Star Wars, so that made me wonder what's going on with Space Force now. Well, they have a budget of almost $29 billion, and even with all the budget concerns, Trump, who initially created the Space Force, will keep it just like Biden did before him. Last month at the Space Symposium, the chief of space operations, General Saltzman, stated that space superiority is now a prerequisite for battlefield success. And his deputy chief, Lieutenant General Sean Brown, said, "We're moving past protect and defend, and yeah, we're going to talk about offensive capabilities in space. Space, the final frontier, and the U.S. doesn't care if it's bloody, as the fight for the frontier land they stole from the indigenous here. Space is theirs, god damn it." What do you think of Space Force, Rick?
I think that people should take it more seriously. Like, honestly, there's lots of jokes about it, but like, there's this theoretical weapon that they've been trying to do from space for a while. They call it, the nickname is rods from God. But the idea is you have a big, long piece of tungsten that's sitting on a satellite that you can just like drop from space onto a thing. So it's like basically like man-made meteorite crashes into whatever you want it to, is the idea. And it's not good. It's not a good idea. It's not a good plan to have that up there. But in general, we're also seeing like during when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, a bunch of European weather satellites were put out of commission because they were a joint program between the Germans and the Russians, and the Germans turned off their parts of the satellite. The same thing with like the ISS. ISS is basically over. And so like cooperation in space is like done so. Like the idea that we're all going to like work together on like science and space in like this peaceful way, that's done for. The ISS was like the symbol of that, and it's I think it's deorbiting next year, maybe the year after that. It's short for this world, or it's I guess long for this world.
Yeah,
because it's about to be back.
Back down on Earth.
Meanwhile, China and India have space programs that are becoming more intense and certainly cheaper. That's the other thing, is like the U.S. spends a lot of money on getting things into space, and a lot of money on the things that it puts into space. And other countries have figured out that like you don't have to spend $1 trillion on a space program. And so this is like the big difference between the 80s when Reagan was talking about, Star Wars missile defense, and today is I would be willing to bet that like you could do the same sort of program. That at the time I think they were saying it was like going to be trillions of dollars, like $2 trillion or something, which in the 80s is a lot more than it is now. But in general, I think almost all that stuff is much cheaper to do now, and that means that people will forego that treaty. Not just the U.S., but like many countries, I think, are starting to look at that sort of thing.
Yeah. Sorry,
I wouldn't put.
Go ahead.
Because the rods from God kind of thing, and this sort of like cyber warfare and energy weapons and all this like stuff that they're from space, it's just not. It's not. The nuclear treaties don't apply to it, right? So suddenly, like, you can have form of weapon superiority that goes beyond nuclear, that isn't technically nuclear.
Yeah,
and that's worrisome.
Yeah, I was gonna say like there's a part we'll get to too. Is like. I think the U.S. like so on that before we played this, and I was making the statement like China's not a superpower because they don't have the military, and it's all to do with the spending of the military. Like, that's what they're looking at. And so, like, that's what the United States thinks. Like, we'll just spend more and we'll just be bigger and better out in space, you know? So it's, I don't know.
The thing is, measuring it by spending is kind of disingenuous, you know, because like we spend so much more to develop. Like when Iran launched missiles into Israel, it cost them between 100 and 200 billion dollars, and to deflect those missiles, it costs like the U.S. and Israel, like, or rather 100 to 200 million dollars, and it cost the U.S. 1.2 billion dollars to deflect the missiles. And it's the same with like the Chinese Navy is about the same size as the U.S. Navy right now, depending on like what you're. But it didn't cost them nearly as much to make it as it cost us to make our Navy, right? So that's the difference.
Yeah, as for current spending on military, in 2024, we spent just shy of $1 trillion, $997 billion. That number was not easy to like, you had to directly ask for that. If you asked for just military spending, like, it just kept bringing up 2023. It would not bring up the 2024 number, and I don't know why. This is over 3 times more than what China spent, which is $314 billion, to Rick's point, what he was just talking about, and constitutes at least 40% of all countries' military spending. Reminder, we are still only 5% of the world's population and have the most expensive healthcare costs because the government refuses to go to universal single payer and eliminate the for-profit healthcare ghoulish system we do have. During the Cold War, military personnel was kept at about 2 million, and now there are about 1.3 million. And you will see in the next section that when 1 billion is spent on the military, it provides less jobs. Like they always say, it's a job creator, but it provides less jobs than many of the other sectors like education and transit. In 1990, the military budget was $305 billion. In 2023, since I couldn't, oh no, wait, I did get it for, it's 997, but I did this off of the 2023 number. The base pay for the private in 1990 at the tail end of the Cold War was $21,000. And today, 35 years later, it's $25,800. If you put an inflation calculator on that, the $21,000 in 1990 equates to over $51,000 today. So they're making less money. So figuring in that there is 700,000 less personnel, I'm highly doubting it is spent on them. Even figuring in inflation on the total spend, it was less than 2.5 times, or it was 2.47 times more. So that money is going to the MIC. So did you want to say anything else on this section, Rick?
No, I think he covered it.
Okay, so Freedom Nad 91 is saying, aren't we trying to work on aircraft carriers in space, or was that like a meme? I don't know. I don't know much about the space stuff. I got to look into it more. What do you think, Rick? I
know they've been working on planes that go to space. There was some speculation the last fighter jet that China produced that the public knows about now. There's some speculation on whether or not some of the jet configurations on it are able to fly directly into space. An aircraft carrier sounds nuts. That would be prohibitively expensive. But the idea of being able to fly through space during maneuvers and when launching missiles, that's very, very soon. And we've seen even in the commercial sector that was Virgin Space was one of those that they were using missiles to get into space from planes. There's definitely stuff going on with that.
Yeah.
And a lot of it I know about. So that'll be fun to see when a more serious direct war breaks out.
Yeah, my brother's just upset that he can't just strap on a jet pack and come over here. He's thinking that we should be the Jetsons by now, but they lied to us about the Jetsons. All right, I'm going to play section 2.
Pentagon profits, waste, and theft. The arms procurement program run by the Department of Defense is rife with fraud and profiteering. The DoD's own auditors admit the military cannot account for 1/4 of what it spends, over $100 billion a year. Such sums do not just evaporate, they find their way into somebody's pockets. A Secretary of Defense during the Bush administration, Donald Rumsfeld, admitted that according to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions. When Bush called for more than $48 billion in new defense spending, this caused retired Vice Admiral Jack Shanahan to remark, "How do we know we need $48 billion since we don't know what we're spending and what we're buying?" 9. If the Pentagon's misplaced funds were returned to state and local governments on a pro rata basis, they all would be able to pay off their debts, vastly improve their educational and health services, and still have funds left over for other things. There's more to this story. The Pentagon was storing $41 billion in excess supplies gathering dust or rusting away. The U.S. Army allocated $1.5 billion to develop a heavy-lift helicopter, even though it already had heavy-lift helicopters, and the Navy was building an almost identical one. Congress voted for C-130 cargo planes the Air Force did not want because they were so dysfunctional, and extra B-2 bombers that the Pentagon never requested. And Congress added $6.2 billion to a supplemental spending bill for, among other things, a C-17 aircraft that Defense Secretary Robert Gates recommended terminating. The Air Force started to develop an F, a -22 fighter plane in 1986 that cost $29 billion and was still not combat ready 20 years later in 2005. The Pentagon is spending billions to build 187 F-22 fighter planes that seem intended for war with a major power. After a furious battle in Congress, funding for an additional 7 F-22 seconds was cut, saving the country $1.75 billion. But the Air Force has plans for yet another super fighter plane, the F-35. The Pentagon approved a plan to spend $16 billion to lease a 100 jetliner refueling tankers from Boeing, which cost more than buying the planes. The tankers had been built by Boeing in part with Pentagon funds. The Government Accountability Office, watchdog agency for Congress, reported that the Pentagon had no sure way of knowing how $200 billion was spent waging war in Iraq and Afghanistan. The GAO identified instances in which costs were off by 30% or more. Multi-billion-dollar Pentagon contracts were plagued by inadequate planning and inadequate oversight, according to the GAO Controller General. A third or more of government property that Halliburton and its subsidiaries were paid to manage in Iraq could not be located by auditors. Halliburton and other contractors were repeatedly paid for work never performed. They grossly overcharged the Pentagon for fuel supplies, construction, and meals for troops, while delivering substandard equipment and contaminated water to U.S. bases in Iraq. 2 members of Congress concluded that Halliburton was systematically overcharging on hundreds of requisitions every day, with an enormous cumulative cost to the taxpayer of billions of dollars. The general feeling, concluded one Army contracting officer, is that the contractor is out of control. 12. Military contractors generally enjoy what are called cost-plus contracts. They get paid whatever it costs to do the job plus a guaranteed profit. There are no penalties for failure. Hence, the more wasteful the performance, the costlier is the job and the bigger the profit. There is a disincentive to get the job done efficiently and economically when waste is built into the system. 13. Defense contractors have been known to make out duplicate bills to different military agencies, getting paid twice for the same service. Tests have been rigged and data falsified to make weapons appear more effective than they actually are. Many top defense contractors have been under criminal investigation, but most fraud goes unpunished. The public purse is pilfered on small items too. The military paid $511 for light bulbs that cost 90 cents and $640 for toilet seats that cost $12. And after paying the Boeing company $5,096 for 2 pliers, the tough Pentagon procurers renegotiated the price down to $1,496, a real bargain. Billions are spent on military pensions that go mostly to upper-income senior officers. Vast sums have been expended at military bases for golf courses, polo fields, restaurants, and officers' clubs, replete with gold-plated chandeliers, oak paneling, and marble fixtures. There is a Pentagon-leased luxury hotel outside Disney World in Florida that requires an annual federal subsidy of $27 million. 2 golf courses at Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland were not enough, so a third one costing $5 million was built. And in the midst of intense budget cutting of human services, Congress allocated $1 billion for 7 luxury aircraft to service the Pentagon's top commanders. Meanwhile, of the 15,000 disabled troops returned from Iraq by 2004, many went for months without receiving pay and medical benefits to which they were entitled. Corporate contractors enjoy these special features of military spending. There are no risks to speak of. Unlike automobile manufacturers who must worry about selling the cars they produce, the weapons dealer has a guaranteed contracted market. Almost all contracts are awarded at whatever price a corporation sets without competitive bidding. That means the defense firm can name its own price and the Pentagon pays up. Many large military contracts have cost overruns of 100 to 700%. Cite a notorious example, the C-5A transport plane had a $4 billion cost overrun. In recent years, the price tag on the 95 biggest weapons programs have grown nearly $300 billion beyond their original cost estimates. The Pentagon directly subsidizes corporate defense contractors with free research and development, public lands, buildings, renovations, and yearly cash subsidies totaling in the billions. Defense spending does not compete with the consumer market and is virtually limitless. There are always more advanced weapons of destruction to develop and obsolete weaponry to replace. Various services that used to be performed by military personnel, kitchen duty, laundry, military prison construction, heavy equipment maintenance, and certain security assignments are now contracted out to private companies that perform these tasks often with little oversight and for heavily padded prices. Military spending is much preferred by the business community to other forms of government expenditure. Public monies invested in occupational safety, environmental protection, drug rehabilitation, or public schools provide for human needs and create jobs and buying power. But such programs expand the nonprofit public sector, bringing no direct returns to business. If anything, shifting demand away from the private market. In contrast, a weapons contract injects huge amounts of public funds directly into the private corporate sector at a rate of profit that is generally 2 or 3 times higher than what other investments yield. U.S. leaders say that military spending creates jobs. So do pornography and prostitution, but there might be more worthwhile ways of boosting employment. In any case, civilian spending generates more jobs than military spending. Jobs created by spending $1 billion on the military, 8,555. Jobs created by spending $1 billion on healthcare, 10,779. Jobs created by spending $1 billion on Educat Ion, 17,687. Jobs created by spending $1 billion on mass transit, 19,795.19. To put military spending in perspective, consider the following. The $800 million Congress saved in 1997 by cutting supplementary security. Income for 150,000 disabled children amounts to less than 1/3 the cost of building and maintaining one B-2 bomber. The $5.5 trillion spent just for nuclear weapons over the last half-century exceeded the combined federal spending on education, social services, job programs, the environment, general sciences, energy production, law enforcement, and community and regional development during that same period. To keep America on its arms spending binge, corporate lobbyists and the Department of Defense itself spend millions of dollars on publicity to boost various weapons systems. The DoD finances military-related research projects at major universities and propagates the military viewpoint at hundreds of conferences and exhibitions and in many thousands of brochures, press releases, articles, and books written by independent scholars in the pay of the Pentagon.
Okay. All right. So that was Pentagon
Brady said
profit.
they're spending more on nukes.
What'd you say?
I was gonna say he says that they're spending more on nukes than cops. That's it. That's impressive amount of money.
Yeah, it really is. Well, I wonder if that holds true today, though, because I would say in the last 15 years the cops have benefited a lot. I love that Speechify screwed up on the word education. That was kind of funny. But anyhow, so Section 2 is Pentagon profits, waste, and theft. So who is buying that 2 jets just fell into the sea? And if that is true, what a huge waste of money those planes were. Do you buy that they fell into the sea, Rick? I don't know. I don't know if I'm buying it.
The thing is, it's, what is it? Hamlin's razor, don't attribute to malice what can be easily explained by stupidity. Like, I think that they are that dumb that they let planes fall off.
All right, okay.
I think well, maybe not. Maybe they did it on purpose.
Lord
Their
knows.
excuse was very. They're like, we were trying to quickly dodge a missile. It's like, really, bro? I don't buy that one.
Freedon is saying, when I was in the Army in 2010, 2014, there were talking of some support MOS being forced to reclass because of all the private contractors. I don't know what MOS is, do you?
That's like
military
your particular job in
Yeah.
there. They're talking like all of this kind of accountant, and they're saying no more of those. And
Yeah.
they're just gonna, like,
So it's all like the privatization of the military. Because
and that's what happened to NASA too. Like that's all Elon Musk did. Like all the money he's been making off of SpaceX is just privatized NASA. Like they're just and also military contracts.
yeah.
On top of that.
Yeah. So, and also the whole overspending thing reminds me of the Lucille Bluth. I mean, it's one banana, Michael. What could it cost? $10? That's what kept coming in my mind when I heard this. But anyhow, in 2023, there was a report put out that the Pentagon could not account for 63% of its $4.1 trillion in assets. The main issue is they don't know what they got on hand and just keep buying stuff. Some great economic planning there, I guess. When you aren't held accountable, what does it matter? So according to the responsiblestatecraft.org, the F-35 program is a great example. The Pentagon technically owns the global pool of spare parts for all variations of the F-35, but the program's contractors, mainly Lockheed Martin and Pratt & Whitney, managed those parts. According to the GAO, the Pentagon relies on contractors to record the cost, total quantity, and locations of F-35 parts in the global spares pool. The department has estimated that the value of F-35 parts in the possession of the contractors is over $220 billion, but the GAO reports that this is likely significantly understated. And in 2024 marked the 7th year in a row that the Pentagon failed its audit. And then you had Sanders had submitted an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act that I think this was back in 2023 that would require the Pentagon to return some of its budget, 10% if it fails an audit. This band-aid of a measure was, of course, voted down in Congress. Then there was the whopping $80 million. $80 million isn't like... like I would love to have $80 million, but in terms of the money that, we use spending in the United States, that $80 million that the Doge is claiming they found, and that's just a drop in the bucket to the trillions missing, because there's something like 2.3 trillion or something more than that missing. Rick, are you there?
Yeah, and I think that this is the thing is like it's not so much that like they just don't keep track of it. They just buy stuff because like there's no bottom to their bank account, right? Like so they could just keep buying things and keeping track of what they're buying. They're just like, oh yeah, like put that on the whatever account, and like they just buy more shit.
Yeah.
And it proves like that the like government funding, like the money is not real. Right, like when it comes to government funding, they can just spend as much as they want to, because there's never a point at which they're like, "Oh, you're overdrafted on the Pentagon account." Like that's never going to happen.
Yeah, no, they'll just
of course, there's no oversight. They have like an account who knows like it's going to their friends or if they're paying whatever, like how much is the how much are they charging for the Big Macs at the McDonald's and the Pentagon?
I know. They're probably charging $100 a Big Mac because a banana is $10. So, all right,
the picture's kind of little, but all the little gray dots in mine. That's like the active. It's the boneyard for all of the fighter jets that they built that are just like sitting in a yard, like your redneck neighbors. Fucking cars, up on blocks. No. We have like a
send me
desert full of.
Send me that picture because I'll put it up on the YouTube. Oh, that I'm putting these on YouTube too. I forgot to ask if that was okay with you. I was like, I really should. I was like, I really should ask Rick if it was okay. So, yeah, send it over to me. All right, let's listen to Harming Our Own.
Harming our own. The U.S. military inflicts numerous hidden costs upon the economy, the environment, and human life. The armed services use millions of acres of land at home and abroad in bombing runs and maneuvers, causing long-lasting damage to vegetation, wildlife, and public health. Military target ranges on the Puerto Rican island of Vieques, in South Korea, and even within the United States are heavily contaminated with petroleum, products, uranium, and other carcinogenic heavy metals, causing cancer rates among nearby inhabitants several hundred times higher than in any normal population. The U.S. military is a major polluter, using vast amounts of ozone-depleting materials and generating 500,000 tons of toxins yearly. The Pentagon admitted to Congress that some 17,500 military sites violate federal environmental laws. The military contaminates the air, soil, and groundwater with depleted uranium, plutonium, tritium, and other toxic wastes, while amassing vast stockpiles of lethal chemical and biological agents. There are some 20,000 radioactive and toxic chemical sites on military bases and nuclear weapons plants and laboratories across the United States. Many of these have repeatedly released radioactive and other harmful wastes into the air and waterways, including millions of gallons dumped illegally into makeshift evaporation pits and seepage basins. Populations at home and abroad have been sickened by nuclear bomb tests. After decades of denial, the government is conceding that American. The U.S. Global Military Empire 143. Workers who helped make nuclear weapons were exposed to radiation and chemicals that produced cancer and early death. The Department of Energy admits that it would cost astronomical sums and take decades to clean up the contamination generated by nuclear arms production and testing, and that most of these sites actually will never be cleaned up, but will need permanent stewardship for generations to come. During the 1950s, the U.S. Army conducted germ warfare experiments in American cities, causing numerous civilian illnesses and deaths, a rare epidemic of infections. The U.S. Coast Guard, responsible for policing our waterways, has dumped more than 100,000 used batteries containing lead, mercury, and other chemicals into our rivers and bays. The military is also a danger to its own ranks. Every year, hundreds of enlisted personnel are killed in vehicular accidents, firing exercises, practice flights, maneuvers, and other readiness preparations. During World War II, the Navy tested the effects of poison gas using sailors as guinea pigs. As many as 60,000 took part in the experiments, many suffering long-term disabilities. Tens of thousands of veterans have been sickened or have died from exposure to atomic testing during the 1950s or from toxic herbicides used in the Vietnam War. And more than 200,000 Gulf War veterans may have been exposed to depleted uranium or other highly hazardous materials, including anthrax inoculations that are suspected of causing serious illness. In 1994, Senator John Rockefeller issued a report revealing that for at least 50 years, the Department of Defense used hundreds of thousands of military personnel in human experiments involving intentional exposure to toxic chemical agents that cause serious ailments. The Department of Defense is one of the biggest and cruelest users of animal experimentation. Animals are burned, shot, bled, irradiated, dosed with biological, nuclear, and chemical weapons, assaulted with cannonades of noise, exposed to deadly viruses, and then studied as they suffer lingering deaths.
Hold on, Rick. I'll let you up in 1 second. The studio is so slow on everything. It's like it takes forever once you hit a button. All right, so Rick will be back up. He said from the comments, OMG, I know the sister of one of the activists who stopped the testing on, what is that, Beachies? Yeah. Come on. Why is this? Sorry, Rick, it's... I don't even know if, did it dump you or did you jump down? I'm wondering if Ash is still there and she might, okay, here we go. For some reason, the studio is so slow tonight.
Real slow.
Oh my.
No, it dumped me. I was ordering a pizza and it kicked me out.
All right. So a few chapters ago, Rick and I were chatting about Agent Orange, and I brought up how they were willing to poison their own soldiers with it too. Agent Orange is known to have caused both cancerous and non-cancerous diseases and also birth defects. My friend's father, who told me about being in the Navy and waking up in the morning to seeing the powdery dusting on the ship after the helicopters sprayed, fears that he may be the reason for his daughter's ailments. So just how much pollution does the MIC create? The U.S. military is a significant source of pollution, the world's largest institutional user of petroleum, and a major producer of greenhouse gases, emitting more than many countries annually, but it also creates environmental damage through its activities. So in 2020, the cost of war project estimated that the U.S. military emitted 51 million tons of carbon dioxide. That is equivalent to the CO2 emissions from countries like Greece, DPRK, Singapore, and Bulgaria, and more than 146 others, or 70% of the countries out there just from our military. All right, so that's not even our country, that's the military. According to the estimates from Brown University, since 2001, the U.S. military has emitted over 1.2 billion metric tons of greenhouse gas. War causes environmental degradation, including water contamination from oil and depleted uranium, forest destruction, and harm to wildlife. The U.S. military loves using burn pits to dispose of waste, which releases various pollutants into the air, causing problems for both the local communities and their own soldiers. They also use depleted uranium in armor-piercing munitions and plating on tanks, which leaches into the land, poisoning it. And plenty of the chemical weapons are used. Lots of that is used right here at home on protesters, too. So just like going back to the Agent Orange, my dad was drafted into the Army just as he finished college. He talked, so this was 1960, early 60s. And so he talks about things that happened on the base. I even recorded some of his stories and posted them years ago, where he kept telling me that they'll probably lock him up. And I told him that his stories aren't as worse as the ones that are already out there, like, what happened in Miley and Beers for Ears and chemical weapon, Agent Orange use, right? Hey, Rick, you're making a lot of noise.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. Well, one of his stories I brought...
It's muted still.
Oh, that's okay. Well, one of his stories I have brought up before involves Agent Orange, because it was such a great deforestation chemical. Agent Orange was used on the bases as vegetation control, and one thing my dad definitely noticed is the dudes who went around spraying this stuff always seemed to have lots of melanin. It is estimated 300,000 U.S. military members died from exposure, and another 650,000 have been treated at VA for symptoms from exposure. We sent 2.7 million soldiers, so that is more than a third who suffered from the Agent Orange. The Vietnam government has estimated about 400,000 deaths due to the poison, and 2 million who got sick with symptoms and huge destruction to their foliation and environment. So, and that 400,000 is civilians and military. So we probably lost as many people as they did in the military, military people, right? So, do you have anything else to add to this one?
Using Agent Orange just to kill weeds is wild. That's
yeah.
Also not surprising in the least that they would do that. Mm-hmm. The testing on Vieques is talking about how they use different islands as just as testing ranges. And there were a bunch of protests from independentistas in Puerto Rico about it, and a bunch of them went out to camp on the bomb testing ranges so that they couldn't drop bombs on them, right? They're like trying to clear the islands out.
Oh, yeah.
And they're arrested and thrown in for a while. But a friend of mine's mom is like an activist in Puerto Rico, and her uncle was like one of the guys who went out and did that and sat out there so that they couldn't bomb them.
Yeah.
And couldn't bomb the islands. But yeah, like this is the thing. And the other thing I was going to mention is the people living outside of like the Trinity test, where they tested the first nuclear bomb. To this day, people are still like way higher cancer rates. People in that community who are almost entirely indigenous, they end up not talking about if they'll get cancer, but when.
Yeah. Like
nobody makes it to their 60s. Yeah. Like that's just not a thing. And yeah, to this day, there's no reparations for that. There's no acknowledgement that that's even a thing. They insisted like, oh yeah, that's too long ago and too dispersed or whatever, but it's obviously not.
I had a one of my jobs in the 90s. Doing admin for a team that came in from, I don't know, there's a big contractor called Morrison Knudsen. So they were working, but I was just doing temp work at the time. So I did their administration I was like, I was a receptionist basically, but I was doing other paperwork too. But that was Watertown Army Corps of Engineers, and they were there to clean up beryllium, like right in the heart of Watertown, and the mall's like right next door to where they were cleaning all this up. So it's, yeah, they had no care for whatever they were doing. I mean, I told you the story of the company my father was working for in Boston, that they were telling him to just go outside and dump the stuff near the river. So I don't know. All right, let's listen to 4.
Economic imperialism. In recent decades, U.S. industries and banks have invested heavily in the Third World, attracted by the rich natural resources and the high return that comes with underpaid labor and the absence of taxes, environmental regulations, and occupational safety costs. The U.S. government grants subsidies and tax concessions to corporations for their overseas investments, along with compensations for losses due to war or confiscation by a foreign government. Washington refuses aid to any country that nationalizes, without full compensation, assets owned by U.S. firms. U.S. corporate investments do little to improve and much to diminish the lot of third world peoples. The transnationals push out local businesses and preempt their markets. American agribusiness cartels, heavily subsidized by the U.S. government, dump surplus products in other countries at below cost and undersell local farmers. They expropriate the best land in these countries for cash crop exports, usually monoculture crops requiring large amounts of pesticides, leaving less acreage for the hundreds of varieties of organically grown foods that feed the local populations. By displacing local populations from their lands and robbing them of their self-sufficiency, corporations create overcrowded labor markets of desperate people who are forced to toil for poverty wages, often in violation of the country's minimum wage laws. In Haiti, for instance, workers are paid 11 cents an hour by corporate giants such as Disney and Walmart. The United States is one of the few countries that has refused to sign an international convention for the abolition of child labor and forced labor. This position stems from the child labor practices of U.S. corporations throughout the Third World, where children as young as 12 suffer high rates of injuries and fatalities. The savings that big business reaps from cheap labor abroad are not passed on in lower prices to their customers. Corporations do not outsource to far-off regions in order to save money for U.S. consumers, but to increase their margin of profit. Thus, shoes made by Indonesian children working 12-hour days for 13 cents an hour cost a company only $2.60 to be made, but still are sold for $90 or more in the United States. Since World War II, hundreds of billions of dollars in U.S. military aid have been given to some 85 nations. The U.S. has trained and equipped some 2.3 million foreign troops and police, the purpose being not to defend these countries from outside invasion, but to protect capital investments and the ruling oligarchs from their own restive populations. U.S. aid money also subsidizes the infrastructure needed by corporate investors in the Third World, ports, highways, and refineries. U.S. non-military aid to foreign nations comes with strings attached. The food that the United States offers as aid must be produced on U.S. soil rather than in the countries that are supposed to be helped. Other aid monies often must be spent on U.S. products, and the recipient nation is required to give investment preferences to U.S. companies, shifting consumption away from home-produced foods and the U.S. global military empire 145. Commodities in favor of imported ones, creating more dependency, hunger, and debt. The United States Agency for International Development used to boast on its website that the principal beneficiary of America's foreign assistance programs has always been the United States. Close to 80% of contracts and grants go directly to American firms. 32. Much aid money never sees the light of day, going directly into the personal coffers of sticky-fingered officials in the recipient countries. USAID openly proclaims that one of the prime goals of U.S. foreign assistance is to further America's foreign policy interests in expanding democracy and free markets, that is, making the world safe for U.S. capitalism. Some critics say that the U.S. government uses aid as a political weapon to coerce governments to do what Washington wants, and to reward political and military partners, rather than to advance genuine social or humanitarian causes abroad. Thus, in June 2009, President Obama terminated $64 million in aid to Nicaragua's leftist Sandinista government, just as President Reagan had done in 1981. Obama claimed that the Sandinistas might have manipulated municipal elections in 2008, of which there seemed to be little evidence. Aid also comes from other sources. In 1944, the United Nations created the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Voting power in both organizations is determined by a country's financial contribution. As the largest donor, the United States has a dominant voice, followed by Germany, Japan, France, and Great Britain. The IMF operates in secrecy with a select group of bankers and finance ministry staffs drawn mostly from the rich nations. The World Bank and IMF are supposed to assist nations in their development. What actually happens is another story. A poor country borrows from the World Bank to build up some aspect of its economy. Should it be unable to pay back the heavy interest because of declining export sales or some other reason, it must borrow again. But the IMF imposes a structural adjustment program requiring debtor countries to grant tax breaks to the transnational corporations, reduce wages, and make no attempt to protect local enterprises from foreign imports and foreign takeovers. The debtor nations are pressured to privatize their economies, selling at scandalously low prices their state-owned mines, railroads, and utilities to private corporations. They are forced to open their forests to clear cutting and their lands to strip mining, without regard to the ecological damage done. The debtor nations also must cut back on subsidies for health, education, transportation, and food, spending less in order to have more money to meet debt payments. Required to grow cash crops for export earnings, they become even less able to feed their own populations. Here then we have explained a mystery. The number of people living in poverty is growing at a faster rate than the world's population. Why, as aid and loans and capital investments have increased abroad over the last half-century, so has poverty. Answer: such programs were never designed to fight poverty, but are intended to augment the wealth of transnational investors at the expense of local populations. Throughout the Third World, real wages have declined, and national debts have soared to the point where debt payments absorb almost all of the poorer countries' export earnings. Some critics conclude that IMF and World Bank structural adjustments do not work because the end result is less self-sufficiency and more poverty for the recipient nations. Why then do the rich member states continue to fund the IMF and World Bank? It is because foreign loan programs do work, depending on who benefits. Their intent is not to uplift the masses in other countries, but to serve the interests of global finance, to take over the lands and local economies of Third World peoples, indenture their labor with enormous debts, privatize public services, and eliminate the trade competition these countries might have posed had they ever really been allowed to develop. In these respects, foreign loans and structural adjustments, aid and investments, all work very well indeed, not for the recipient nations, but for the predatory lenders.
Okay, so on that, oh my God, everything's slow. Okay. There's so much that he brings up that is just in motion, and what Parenti's speaking on is still happening and still going on and stuff like that. But I wanted to bring up neo-colonialism here because economic imperialism is definitely tied to that, since it is one of the tools used to continue the oppression that the former colonizer, and since you can't see me do the scare quotes, the sarcasm quotes, just know that they're there on the former, and then uses to keep its former colony. I don't know if you ever got into a predatory loan situation, but it is impossible to dig yourself out from under one, and the damage lasts decades and soon to be a century for some old colonies. The only way we should be helping these countries from the imperial core is to pay them reparations for all that was stolen and destroyed, and with no strings attached, and allowing them to be their own countries run by their own people. Rick, so getting into this, we were talking to a guy from ACP yesterday, right? You remember that in Braden's Live, and you were kind of bringing that up about Hawaii, like when we were asking him, should Hawaii, Hawaii is a colony, and he kept using the word territories, because territories are U.S. colonies, but we decided to give them a special name. So we just want to hide that we're doing colonialism. But yeah, so Rick, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, all right. So so just talking about that, and I wanted to bring up, if anyone wants to read How to Hide an Empire, it's Dan Immerwahr, because he talks about that's where, like, he was talking about the territories and the colonies, like why we use the word territory instead. And then, so Kwame Nkrumah condemned neocolonialism as the worst form of imperialism. He wrote, "For those who practice it, it means power without responsibility, and for those who suffer from it, it means exploitation without redress." I have a piece I was going to. Okay, wait a sec. I'm getting another. Oh, come on. I have to verify again. I don't know why TikTok is not liking me tonight. All right. Okay. All right. So I'm back. Okay. So Nkrumah wrote Neocolonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism. And you can find that on Marxist.org. So I'm just going to read the first couple of paragraphs. So it was written in 1965, and this is just from the introduction. The neocolonialism of today represents imperialism in its final and perhaps its most dangerous stage. In the past, it was possible to convert a country upon which a neocolonial regime had been imposed, Egypt in the 19th century is an example, into a colonial territory. Today, this process is no longer feasible. Old-fashioned colonialism is by no means entirely abolished. It still constitutes an African problem, but it is everywhere on the retreat. Once a territory has become nominally independent, it is no longer possible, as it was in the last century, to reverse the process. Existing colonies may linger on, but no new colonies will be created. In place of colonialism as the main instrument of imperialism, we have today neocolonialism. The essence of neocolonialism is that the state, which is subject to it, is, in theory, independent and has all the outward trappings of international sovereignty. In reality, its economic system, and thus its political policy, is directed from outside. The methods and form of this direction can take various shapes. For example, in the extreme case of the troops of the imperial power may garrison the territory of a neo-colonial state and control the government of it. More often, however, the neo-colonialists' control is exercised through economic and monetary means. The neo-colonial state may be obliged to take the manufactured products of the imperialist power to the exclusion of competing products from elsewhere. Control over government policy in the neo-colonial state may be secured by payments towards the cost of running the state, by the provision of civil servants in positions where they can dictate policy, and by monetary control over foreign exchange through the imposition of a banking system controlled by the imperial power, hence the IMF. So, if you want to, you can read more on that on Marxist.org. So, what do you think of neocolonialism, Rick?
Oh, I think it sucks. No, it's clever because it gets liberals to like join in on the fun again, like they used to, right? Like there's a minute where like liberals were like, "Ew, colonialism," but then they're like, "What if it was an aid program?" You know, what if it was what if what we were doing is economic development, right? Like that's like, what if we just like use these like new terms to define the same exact thing in like a slightly different way?
Yeah.
Like
kinda,
what if
kind of like using territory.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and like there's also this like distancing that comes from it. Like they're talking about like there's also like no accountability anymore because it's not your colony, right? If they have problems that's going on there, it's because of corruption. And you hear that all the time when you're talking about people like, when I point out to people who are trying to support capitalism, like, hey, like look at all these countries that are doing awful under capitalism. They're like, well, yeah, but they have corrupt governments.
Yeah.
This is not the problem of capitalism. You couldn't do that with like the British Empire. Like you couldn't blame the poverty in Bangladesh the Bangladeshis.
people. Yeah.
because it's that's the issue, is that it's like it's your government, but now there's that disconnect where you can just kind of blame people for their own problems. Like, blame the victim becomes a whole lot easier under the new neo-colonial system.
Yeah. And they do that to communist countries too, because they sanction them, up the wazoo, and then, don't allow them to have, good, decent trade with other countries, because if the countries want to do trade with us, and yeah, it's such a mess. All right. I'm gonna play section 5.
The U.S. government intervenes in countries around the world supposedly to fight terrorism, stop drug trafficking, protect our national security, and defend freedom and democracy. Closer examination shows that U.S. rulers mainly have been defending the capitalist world from social change, even when the change has been peaceful and democratic. So they overthrew reformist governments in Iran, Guatemala, the Congo, the Dominican Republic, Brazil, Chile, and Uruguay. Similarly, in Greece, the Philippines, Indonesia, and at least 10 Latin American nations, military oligarchs, largely trained and financed by the Pentagon and the CIA, overthrew popular governments that pursued egalitarian policies for the benefit of the destitute classes. And in each instance, the United States was instrumental in instituting right-wing regimes that were unresponsive to popular needs and wholly accommodating to U.S. investors. In Nicaragua, a U.S.-backed mercenary force killed over 30,000 people, orphaned more than 9,000 children, and destroyed crops, homes, schools, health clinics, and other facilities for an estimated damage of over $3 billion. In Angola and Mozambique, wars waged by CIA-backed forces left several million dead and millions more homeless and destitute. In East Timor, the U.S.-funded Indonesian military slaughtered some 200,000 people, more than one-third of the population. The United States invaded Grenada in 1983 and Panama in 1989 to overthrow reformist governments, replacing both with free market regimes propped up by U.S. force, bringing U.S.-financed elections, along with higher unemployment, lower wages, cutbacks in education and human services, and a dramatic increase in privatization, crime, drugs, and poverty. What Nicaragua, Angola, Mozambique, East Timor, Grenada, and Panama had in common were governments that were redirecting some portion of their goods of the people, putting them very much out of step with the rigors of free market global profiteers. In 1990 to 1991, Iraq asked for a larger share of the oil market to the annoyance of the giant petroleum companies. In retaliation for the slant drilling, the U.S. global military empire, 147 of its oil fields by the feudal rulers of Kuwait, Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. In response, the elder President Bush launched massive bombings that contaminated Iraq's fertile agricultural lands with depleted uranium and killed, by Pentagon estimates, 200,000 people. In the years that followed, Iraq, which once had the highest standard of living in the Middle East, was reduced to destitution, kept down by US-led sanctions, and with its own oil kept off the international market, unable to infringe upon oil cartel profits. Also targeted was Yugoslavia, a fairly large and prosperous country that had retained many socialist features. Some 80% of its economy was in the public sector. Yugoslavia showed no interest in joining NATO or the European Union, and its people, especially in the Serbian Republic, resisted the push to complete privatization. A series of Western-financed secessionist wars helped break Yugoslavia into a cluster of privatized right-wing free market republics with high unemployment and low wages. Yugoslavia leaders were charged with genocide and ethnic cleansing by President Clinton and his associates, and subjected in 1999 to 78 days of bombing by U.S.-led NATO forces that killed or wounded thousands and devastated the industry, infrastructure, and ecology of that once prosperous nation. Subsequent reports revealed that there had been no systematic mass rape and mass atrocity policy by the Serbs as charged by Washington and the Western media, though atrocities had been committed by all sides in the Yugoslav wars. Likewise, the reported mass graves in Kosovo, supposedly containing thousands of Albanians killed by Serbs, failed to materialize once NATO forces occupied that province. The main victims of ethnic cleansing seemed to be the Serbs themselves, as large numbers of them were driven from their ancestral homes in Croatia, Bosnia, and Kosovo, along with many thousands of Roma, Gorani, and Jews. Yugoslavia was destroyed because it refused to make the transition from socialism to free market capitalism.
Okay. Rick, I don't know if you're coming back up, but I don't know. It seems like TikTok's being a little weird tonight. So, spreading democracy, yay. There's a piece that Parenti wrote on Ukraine in 2014, and I don't really want to take the chance of reading it all to you right now because of the algorithms on TikTok and on YouTube. So if you get a chance, look it up. It's from May 14th, 2014. It's a piece called Ukraine and Regime Change. He just explains what was going on in 2014 with Newland's involvement and stuff like that with the U.S. and NATO and stuff. So you can read on that. In 2016, the Washington Post reported that during the Cold War, U.S. attempted regime change 72 times, and with over 350 attempted coups around the world during the same time period, the U.S. was probably involved in a lot more than we know. John Bolton admitted on CNN back in 2022 that he helped with coups and even brought up that his last one he was involved with under Trump in 2019 in Venezuela turned out not to be successful. That is the one that the U.S. tried to install Juan Guaido, who just declared himself the interim president of Venezuela. Along with the attempts in Venezuela since 2010, the U.S. is known to have been involved with the 2011 Libya. The U.S. was part of the NATO coalition that overthrew and unalived Gaddafi because the man nationalized Libya's oil back in the 1970s, and the U.S. didn't like that. This is the one that you can find the video of Hillary Clinton gleefully recalling, "We came, we saw, he died." That one drives me crazy. In the 2010s, the U.S. wanted to get rid of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, with Obama even indicating it was time to get rid of Assad back in 2011 when he stated, "The future of Syria must be determined by its people, but President Bashar al-Assad is standing in the way." When Assad finally was ousted last year, Biden wanted to take credit for setting up the conditions for the overthrow after years of economic and military pressure on Assad. In 2018, the ambassador to Syria, James Jeffrey, proudly called it a cadaver state because of the damage the U.S. and NATO did to it. And just understand, I don't care about these leaders, like most of these leaders that, we talk about. I don't really care about them, but it's the damage that is going on to the people that really matters. And, if someone is elected in their country, the U.S. should not be doing what the U.S. has been doing. November 2019, the attempted coup of Evo Morales in Bolivia, where because he was winning the 2019 election, they claimed there was fraud in the election. Morales resigned, got asylum in Mexico, and returned to Bolivia in 2020. They still say there was fraud, but they're also saying there was fraud on the Anna's side too. Anais, the woman that became president from there. The leaders being overthrown now are not the communist revolutionaries we all look to, but just simply not going along with the U.S., what the U.S. wants. You will get the same treatment as if you were communist. There's an article from the CBC, the Canadian NPR, titled, "The U.S. has covertly destabilized nations. With Canada, it's being done in public." And it was put out this March and this year, where they were warning young Canadians that they may be a target for an attempt at Trump's admin to destabilize Canada. And in it, you see that Canada knows damn well all the sins that its neighbor has committed all over the world. Kind of reminds me of the first they came for communists. It always has been the communists first. All right, I'm going to play, the last section is section 6, and I'll be right back.
Global bloodletting. At one time or another, U.S. leaders, both Democratic and Republican, have supported brutal wars of attrition against popular insurgencies in Guatemala, El Salvador, Haiti, Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. In all these instances, torture and death squad killings were common methods of counterinsurgency. In 1999, President Clinton apologized for past U.S. support of murderous right-wing governments in Guatemala that killed over 200,000 people. Such involvement in violence and widespread repression was wrong, It was a mistake and must never happen again, said the president, even as he continued to support violent interventions against Iraq, Yugoslavia, Haiti, Somalia, and other countries. From 1955 to 1975, U.S. forces dropped almost 8.4 million tons of bombs and napalm, and 18 million gallons of chemical defoliants, destroying over 40% of Vietnam's plantations and orchards and over 40% of its forest lands and much of its aquatic resources. Several million Vietnamese, Laotians, and Cambodians were killed. Millions more were maimed or contaminated by toxic chemicals. Almost 10 million were left homeless. Some 58,000 Americans lost their lives, and hundreds of thousands more were wounded or permanently disabled. But the war did benefit the top 10 military contractors who grossed $11.6 billion. From 1979 into the 1990s, U.S. leaders aided the maniacal Khmer Rouge in Cambodia in order to debilitate the socialist-leaning government of that country, prolonging a civil war that took tens of thousands of lives. U.S. rulers became more friendly toward countries like China, Russia, Vietnam, Libya, and Mozambique when they departed from their collectivist programs and threw their economies open to private investment. Mozambique, for instance, privatized nearly 1,500 state-run firms and removed government protections from many others, causing widespread unemployment and deep impoverishment. In the former communist countries of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, capitalist privatization brought the shutdown of much industry, a drastic reduction of human services, and skyrocketing unemployment, poverty, crime, homelessness, prostitution, and other such blessings of the free market paradise. Colombia is another country that has a history of U.S. finance repression, including the systematic murder by army, police, and paramilitary death squads of tens of thousands of workers, students, farmers, and clergy who try to organize against their overlords. From 1986 to today, upwards of 2,000 labor unionists in Colombia have been assassinated by CIA-supported death squads. Along with weaponry and helicopters, the U.S. military also provides defoliation chemicals that wreaked havoc on Colombia's environment and people. In countries like Indonesia, Nigeria, India, Burma, and Colombia, U.S. transnational corporations have paid police and military to beat, arrest, and in some cases kill labor unionists or residents who protested against the ecological damage and community displacement caused by corporate enterprise. For all their talk about human rights, U.S. government leaders have used force and violence to prop up pro-West regimes throughout the world. Strikes have been outlawed, unions destroyed, wages cut, and dissidents murdered. In the late 1980s, the U.S. national security state helped Mexico carry out a campaign of extermination against progressive reformist elements. Mexican authorities admitted that at least 275 political dissidents were tortured and assassinated. One survivor described how she was raped, tortured, and then forced to watch the torture of her husband and one-year-old daughter. At times, elections are manipulated by U.S. interventionists with the use of enormous sums, dishonest counts, and well-directed terror, as happened in Jamaica, Chile, El Salvador, Panama, Yugoslavia, and elsewhere. But if election outcomes are not satisfactory to U.S. leaders, they are declared rigged and fraudulent, as happened in revolutionary Nicaragua in the 1980s, in Yugoslavia in the 1990s and 2000, and in Haiti in 2000. Such governments are then targeted for the U.S. global military empire 149, destabilization by U.S. rulers. After reformist President Hugo Chavez was elected in Venezuela and proceeded to use oil revenues for social programs for the poor, the White House predictably denounced him as a dictator, a firebrand, and an aggrandizing enemy of the United States, rejecting his overtures for friendly relations as deceptive ploys. In the wake of the 11 September 2001 attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, President Bush invaded Afghanistan, vowing to capture Osama bin Laden, the reputed terrorist perpetrator. 9 years later, the anti-U.S. resistance loomed stronger than ever in Afghanistan, as the United States became immersed more deeply in a costly conflict with local extreme Islamic militants called the Taliban. A number of informed observers, including U.S. Commander General David Petraeus, were of the opinion that al-Qaeda terrorists had long vacated Afghanistan. In 2002, the International Criminal Court was ratified by about 100 nations to prosecute leaders of signatory states who were responsible for war crimes and human rights abuses. Because the United States was not granted a blanket exemption from prosecution, Bush withdrew from the treaty that set up the ICC. In addition, his administration announced it would no longer be bound by the strictures of international law and previous treaties. By 2005, the United States further undermined the ICC by pressuring member states to grant U.S. personnel immunity from prosecution. In May 2005, Angola became the 100th state to sign such an agreement. Had it not done so, it would have lost all U.S. aid. As a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, the United States also could veto any case being referred to the ICC by the UN. In March 2003, in the face of massive anti-war protests around the world and at home, Bush launched an Invasion of Iraq, claiming that Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction, a charge that proved to be without substance. The war was expected to be a quick and profitable venture that would give U.S. petroleum interests direct access to Iraq's vast oil reserves and get rid of the independent-minded leadership in that country. However, almost 4 years later, the Iraq conflict showed no promise of letting up, with U.S. casualties at upwards of 4,500 dead, over 30,000 wounded, and tens of thousands of Iraqis killed and many more seriously injured, while much of Iraq was in ruins. Extreme sectarian violence escalated in Iraq as Shiite and Sunni Muslims attacked U.S. forces and each other. Whole areas were contaminated by depleted uranium from U.S. shells. Ordinary Iraqis took an additional blow when U.S. authorities privatized most of the state-owned economy. Prices skyrocketed, food and housing subsidies were abolished, and rations for the very poor were cut. As of 2010, President Obama made moves to reduce the number of U.S. troops in Iraq while escalating the conflict in Afghanistan, under the questionable notion that the terrorist organization Al-Qaeda was based in that country. Obama also increased the U.S. military presence in Colombia and supported the further expansion of NATO with its threatening encirclement of Russia. At the same time, he continued to threaten Iran and intensified the sanctions and trade embargoes against North Korea. In short, Obama was showing no new modus operandi or bright new goals in the realm of foreign affairs. If we define imperialism as that relationship in which the ruling interests of one country dominate through use of economic and military power, the land, labor, natural resources, finances, and politics of another country, then the United States is the greatest imperialist power in history. U.S. expansionism advances the opportunities for corporate global investment and prevents the emergence of social orders that are revolutionary or reformist or even conservative. Nationalist if they utilize their resources and labor in independent, but there are ways that diminish the profitability and domain of the global empire. The profits of this empire flow into the hands of a few hundred corporate and financial conglomerates, whereas the immense costs are borne by the common people at home and throughout the world.
Okay, so that was the end of chapter 11. And hold on 1 second, sorry. And the mess that's happened when we finally pulled out of Iraq showed exactly that the U.S. never cares about the people of these places. They use human rights as an excuse to get support from back home. They truly only care to enrich the U.S. and its corporations more. So I am going to just read a little bit more to you, and then we will be done. If I can get this stupid thing to open for me. All right. All right. So this was printed in the Milwaukee Independent, but it is actually from Citizens Truth, and it's March 4th, 2021. It's called The American Empire Destabilizing Countries and Wrecking Their Economies Under the Guise of Liberty. So this is going to repeat a little bit from Nkrumah. But in 2004, journalist Ron Suskind quoted a Bush White House advisor, reportedly Karl Rove, as boasting, "We're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality." He dismissed Suskind's assumption that public policy must be rooted in the reality-based community. "We're history's actors," the advisor told him, "and you, all of you, will be left to just study what we do." 16 years later, the American wars and war crimes launched by the Bush administration have only spread chaos and violence far and wide, and this historic conjunction of criminality and failure has predictably undermined America's international power and authority. Back in the imperial heartland, the political marketing industry that Rove and his colleagues were part of has had more success dividing and ruling the hearts and minds of Americans than of Iraqis, Russians, and Chinese. The irony of the Bush administration's imperial pretensions was that America has been an empire from its very founding, and that the White House staffer's political use of the term empire in 2004 was not emblematic of the new and rising empire, as he claimed, but of a decadent, declining empire stumbling blindly into an agonizing death spiral. Americans were not always so ignorant of the imperial nature of their country's ambitions. George Washington described New York as the seat of of an empire in his military campaign against British forces there as a pathway to empire, embrace their state's identity as the Empire State, which is still enshrined in the Empire State Building and the New York State license plates. The expansion of America's territorial sovereignty over Native American lands and the Louisiana. Okay, I don't know. That just I'm almost done here. I'll just read a couple more paragraphs. But that empire expansion was more controversial than most Americans realize. 14 out of 52 U.S. senators voted against the 1848 treaty to annex most of Mexico, without which Americans might still be visiting California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Nevada, Utah, and most of Colorado as exotic Mexican travel spots. The full flowering of the American empire after the Second World War, its leaders understood the skill and subtlety required to exercise imperial power in the post-colonial world. No country fighting for independence from the UK or France was going to welcome imperial invaders from America. So America's leaders developed a system of neocolonialism through which they exercised overreaching imperial sovereignty over much of the world, while scrupulously avoiding terms like empire or imperialism that would undermine their post-colonial credentials, Rick was bringing this up, I was bringing this up. They like to just play with words and use different words so that they hide what they were doing. Once again, I'll bring up the book, How to Hide an Empire by Dan Immerwahl. He talks about how the U.S. went about doing this, and he starts it back at the Guano Wars, the Guano Islands and stuff like that. So it's kind of a neat book if you want to read that. But I am going to end this here right now, and I will be back next week with chapter 12, and we may or may not have Rick with us then. I've given him, he can come up anytime he wants when we're talking about this stuff. I send him what I'm going to talk about so that he can choose and decide. But thank you, Rick, for coming up and, contributing tonight too. So thank you, everyone. Bye.